The wine glass shattered against the marble floor before Vivian even realized her hand had let go of it. "Clumsy," her Aunt Priscilla said from the head of the dining table, not looking up from her plate. "Just like everything else about you." Vivian knelt to gather the shards, the cold marble biting through the thin fabric of her dress, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not be turned back on her within the hour. She was 23 years old, an orphan since she was 16, and for 7 years she had lived inside her aunt's mansion on the edge of the city as something between a ward and an unpaid servant, tolerated because her late father's will had made no other arrangement, and despised, it seemed, for that exact reason. "No gentleman will want you," Priscilla said, setting down her fork with the precise, deliberate motion she used for everything, as though the world owed her patience it had not earned. 23, and not a single proposal. Do you know what people say about you at the Hargrove dinners? They say you sit in corners like furniture. They say you have the personality of wet paper. "I don't attend the Hargrove dinners to be admired," Vivian said quietly, still crouched among the broken glass. "No," Priscilla agreed. "You attend them because I make you, so that at least one person in this family maintains the appearance of decency." The front door opened before Vivian could answer, and the butler's voice carried down the hall announcing a guest neither of them had expected. Priscilla straightened in her chair, smoothing the front of her dress with both hands, because Priscilla always straightened for guests, always performed a particular version of herself for anyone whose opinion she valued more than her niece's. The man who stepped into the dining room did not wait to be properly announced a second time. He moved the way certain men move through rooms that were not built for them, unhurried, entirely at ease, as though the space had simply rearranged itself around his presence, rather than the other way around. He wore a charcoal suit cut close through the shoulders, no logo, no ornament except a signet ring on his right hand that caught the light when he moved, and his dark hair was combed back from a face that gave away nothing at all. "Mr. Marchetti," Priscilla said, rising so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. "We were not told to expect you until tomorrow." "Plans changed," Vincent Marchetti said, and his eyes moved past Priscilla, past the ruined wine and the broken glass, and settled on Vivian, still kneeling on the floor with shards cupped in her palm. He did not smile. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at something he had not expected to find in a room he had already decided was unremarkable. "You should not do that with your bare hands," he said. "You will cut yourself." It was such an ordinary sentence, said in such an ordinary tone, and yet Vivian felt something tighten in her chest at being spoken to as though her safety mattered to someone, a feeling so unfamiliar in that house that it took her a moment to place it. "I'm quite capable," she said, and heard the edge in her own voice before she could soften it. Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. "I don't doubt that," he said. Priscilla, sensing the conversation slipping away from her control, inserted herself between them with the smooth efficiency of a woman who had spent a lifetime managing rooms. "This is my niece, Vivian. She lives with us, though I'm afraid she isn't much for company. Vivian, Mr. Marchetti has business interests he wished to discuss with your uncle regarding the property on Ashford Street." "I came to discuss the property," Vincent said, still looking at Vivian. "But I find myself more interested in why a woman is made to clean glass off a floor in her own home while everyone else watches." The silence that followed was the kind that filled a whole house. Priscilla's smile did not waver, though Vivian, who had spent 7 years learning to read every micro-expression that crossed her aunt's face, saw the fury simmering just beneath it. "She isn't made to do anything," Priscilla said lightly. "Vivian, darling, do go clean yourself up before dinner resumes." Vivian rose, glass still cupped carefully in her palm, and walked from the room without looking back, though she was aware, with a kind of electric certainty she could not explain, that Vincent Marchetti's eyes followed her the entire way to the door, She did not know, standing in the hallway with her heart beating harder than the moment warranted, that the man in her aunt's dining room controlled more of the city's underworld than the police department had ever managed to map, or that her uncle's business dealings had quietly slid him into a debt so deep that the mansion itself had become collateral, or that the man who had just told her not to cut her hands had come to that house, not out of courtesy, but out of calculation, intending to collect what was owed him one way or another. She only knew that for the first time in 7 years, someone in that house had looked at her and seen a person instead of an inconvenience. She would think about that moment for a long time afterward, turning it over the way she turned over the broken glass in her palm, trying to understand why it had cut so much deeper than the wine glass ever could have. If you're already sensing where this one is headed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because this story only gets more dangerous from here. The dinner resumed with a strained formality that Vivian, once she returned with her hands cleaned and a fresh dress on, was expected to sit through in silence at the far end of the table, well beyond the reach of the conversation her Uncle Reginald and Vincent Marchetti were having about the Ashford Street property, and a debt figure that made her uncle's voice thin with a nervousness he was trying badly to disguise as businesslike calm. She worked, when the family allowed it, as a bookkeeper for a small textile importer 3 days a week, one of the only freedoms her aunt permitted because it kept Vivian out of the house and, more importantly, gave Priscilla something to complain about at parties, a niece forced to work like a common clerk. Vivian did not mind the work. She minded the way her aunt spoke of it, as though competence were a shameful secret rather than the only thing in Vivian's life that belonged entirely to her. She was aware, sitting at that dinner table with her eyes on her plate, of Vincent Marchetti's presence the way a person is aware of weather changing before the sky itself shows any sign of it. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his sentences were short, definitive, the kind that ended conversations rather than opened them. Her uncle sweated through most of the meal. Her aunt performed warmth she clearly did not feel. And Vivian, at the far end of the table, found herself glancing up more than once to find Vincent already looking at her, his expression unreadable, his hands still on the table in a way that suggested a man who had trained himself, long ago, never to fidget. "You're not eating," he said at one point, directly to her, cutting straight through her aunt's conversation about the symphony gala, without so much as an apology for the interruption. "I'm not very hungry," Vivian said. "She never eats when we have guests," Priscilla said smoothly, reaching for her wine. "Vivian gets nervous around people of consequence. It's a shame, really. She was raised better than this, but grief does strange things to a girl's manners." Vivian felt the familiar heat climb up her neck, the particular humiliation of being discussed as though she were not present, a subject rather than a person, and she was reaching for some quiet, practiced response, the kind she had perfected over 7 years of these dinners, when Vincent spoke again. "I find her manners perfectly adequate," he said, not raising his voice, not changing his tone, and yet the words landed with enough weight that even Reginald's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "I would be careful, Mrs. Ashford, about deciding what your niece lacks in front of a man who has not asked your opinion of her." Priscilla's face went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling on something brittle and polite. "Of course," she said. "I only meant to explain her quietness." "Her quietness needs no explanation," Vincent said, and returned to his food as though the matter were closed. Vivian sat very still, her pulse loud in her own ears, uncertain whether she should be grateful or terrified that a stranger, a man her uncle clearly feared, had just offended her at her aunt's own table with more conviction than anyone had shown her in years. She did not yet understand what kind of man commanded that kind of instant, absolute silence from a room. She only understood that something in her chest had shifted, some old and carefully buried hope stirring awake against her better judgment, and she pressed her palms flat against her thighs beneath the table to keep her hands from trembling. After dinner, when Reginald excused himself with Vincent into the study to finish their business in private, Priscilla caught Vivian's arm in the hallway with a grip hard enough to bruise. "Whatever you think you're doing, Priscilla hissed. "Stop it. Men like that do not marry girls like you. They use girls like you and discard them before the season is over. Do you understand me?" "I haven't done anything," Vivian said, and it was true, though her aunt's warning lodged itself somewhere cold and uncertain in her chest all the same. "See that you keep it that way," Priscilla said, releasing her arm and sweeping off toward the parlor, leaving Vivian alone in the hallway outside the study door, close enough that she could hear the low murmur of voices inside without making out the words, close enough to feel, absurdly, that whatever was being decided in that room concerned her far more than her aunt or uncle would ever admit. It was 3 days later, on a gray afternoon when Vivian had walked the long way home from the textile office rather than sit through another hour of her aunt's company sooner than necessary, that she turned down a narrow side street and found herself face to face with a scene she had no business witnessing. 2 men in dark coats stood over a third man on his knees against a brick wall, and though no blood had been drawn, the threat in the air was thick enough that Vivian's feet stopped moving entirely before her mind caught up to what she was seeing. One of the standing men turned toward her, and for a single suspended moment, Vivian understood with total clarity that she had walked into something that was not meant to be witnessed by anyone, least of all a stranger with no protection and no way to explain herself. Then a car door opened at the mouth of the alley, and Vincent Marchetti stepped out into the gray afternoon light, his expression sliding instantly from whatever business had brought him there to something sharper and more urgent the moment he saw her standing frozen at the alley's edge. "Get in the car," he said, his voice low and immediate, already crossing the distance between them. "I don't understand what's happening," Vivian said, though some deeper instinct in her had already begun to understand quite a lot. "You don't need to," Vincent said, his hand closing around her elbow. Not rough, but absolute. A grip that brooked no negotiation. "You need to get in the car." She went. She would think, later, about why she had gone so easily, why some part of her had trusted the hand on her arm even as every rational part of her mind screamed that she had just stumbled into the kind of danger her aunt's warnings had never prepared her for. But in that moment, there was no time to think, only to move, and Vincent guided her into the back of a black car with tinted windows and climbed in beside her, pulling the door shut with a sound that seemed to seal off the entire outside world. "What was that?" she asked, once the car had pulled away from the curb and the alley had disappeared behind them. Vincent was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not read, some calculation moving behind his dark eyes that she suspected had very little to do with the men in the alley, and a great deal to do with what to tell her now that she had seen what she had seen. "Business," he said finally. "The kind you should forget you saw." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting today," Vincent said, and something in the set of his jaw told her that pressing further would gain her nothing. She looked out the window instead, watching the city slide past, and tried to steady the racing of her own heart, though she was not entirely certain anymore whether the cause was fear or the disorienting nearness of him in the small, enclosed space of the car, his shoulder inches from hers, the faint scent of cedar and something darker, tobacco perhaps, filling the air between them. "You could have driven past," she said eventually. "You didn't have to stop for me." "No," he agreed, "I didn't have to." He did not explain why he had, and she did not ask again, though the question sat between them for the rest of the drive, unanswered and somehow answered all the same. The car did not take her home. Vincent gave the driver an address she did not recognize, and when she asked, sharp with sudden wariness, he told her simply that she could not go back to her aunt's house tonight, not until he understood exactly what the men in that alley might do with the knowledge that a witness had seen them, and what her connection to the Ashford household might mean for her safety. "You're keeping me," she said, and it was not quite a question. "I'm protecting you," Vincent said. "There's a difference, though I understand why you might not see it that way yet." They arrived at a townhouse in a quiet, guarded part of the city, and Vivian stepped out of the car into an evening that had gone fully dark while they drove, the street lamps casting pools of gold light across cobblestones that felt, somehow, like they belonged to an entirely different life than the one she had woken up to that morning. Vincent led her inside, through a foyer with dark wood paneling and a staircase that curved upward into shadow, and for the first time since the alley, she had a moment to actually look at him, to notice the tension still coiled in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept moving toward the windows even now, as though danger might follow them through the glass. "You're afraid," she said, surprised at her own observation. "I'm careful," he corrected. "There's a difference between the two, though most people confuse them." She thought of her aunt, of 7 years spent being told her caution was cowardice, her quietness was weakness, and something in her responded to his distinction with a kind of relief she had not expected to feel in the middle of what should have been the most frightening night of her life. "Who were those men?" she asked again, quieter this time. Vincent studied her for a long moment before answering, as though weighing how much truth a person could be given before the truth itself became a danger to them. "Men who work for a family that does not like how much territory mine has taken from theirs," he said finally. The man on his knees owed information. "I intended to collect it without an audience. You complicated that." "I'm sorry," Vivian said, though she was not entirely certain what she was apologizing for. "Don't be," Vincent said. "You did nothing wrong. You were simply somewhere you should not have needed to be afraid to walk." She sat down slowly in a chair near the unlit fireplace, her legs finally giving in to the adrenaline that had carried her this far, and watched him move to the window and look out at the street below, with the particular stillness of a man perpetually listening for something the rest of the world could not hear. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Vincent said, not turning from the window, "you stay here until I'm certain no one followed us, and then I take you home, and you tell no one what you saw today. Not your aunt, not your uncle. No one." "And if I can't simply forget it?" He turned then, and something in his expression had shifted, softened almost imperceptibly at the edges, though his voice remained as controlled as ever. "Then you learn to carry it quietly," he said, "as I have learned to carry a great many things." She held his gaze longer than was comfortable, longer than propriety would have permitted in any of the drawing rooms her aunt paraded her through, and felt something pass between them in that silence that neither of them named, though both of them, she suspected, had already recognized it for what it was. The days that followed unfolded with a strange, careful rhythm neither Vivian nor Vincent acknowledged out loud. He did not return her to the mansion that first night until well past midnight, and when he did, he stood at the edge of the property in the dark and told her, in a voice pitched for her ears alone, that if anything felt wrong in that house, if anyone asked questions about where she had been, she was to send word to him immediately. "How would I even do that?" she asked. "I don't have your address. I don't have any way to reach you." He reached into his coat and produced a small card with nothing on it but a telephone number, no name, no company, and pressed it into her hand with a deliberateness that made the simple exchange feel far weightier than it should have. "Memorize it," he said. "Then burn it." She did both that same night, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed in the small room her aunt had assigned her at the far end of the mansion, the number repeating itself in her mind like a private incantation. Priscilla noticed the lateness of her return, of course, and demanded an explanation with the particular venom she reserved for anything Vivian did that fell outside her control. Vivian gave her a half-truth about a delayed train and an emergency at the textile office, and though her aunt's eyes narrowed with suspicion, the story held, if only because Priscilla could not fathom that her forgettable wallflower niece might have anything more interesting to hide. But the household's fortunes, Vivian slowly began to understand, were far more precarious than her aunt's performance of wealth suggested. She overheard fragments, late at night, of arguments between Reginald and Priscilla behind the closed door of the study, her uncle's voice thick with a fear that had nothing to do with social standing and everything to do with survival. Mentions of Marchetti's name spoken like a curse. Mentions of a debt figure so large that Vivian, doing the mental arithmetic she had trained for years as a bookkeeper, understood with a cold clarity that her uncle did not merely owe Vincent money. He owed him the mansion itself, and possibly more than that. It was Vincent who finally told her the truth of it, 3 weeks after the alley, when he arranged to meet her under the pretense of a walk near the textile district, ostensibly by chance, though nothing about the encounter felt accidental to either of them. "Your uncle borrowed against everything he owns," Vincent said, matching his stride to hers along the busy street, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, far enough that no passerby would think anything improper of two acquaintances walking together in daylight. The mansion, the land, even the furniture, technically, though I doubt he understood the paperwork he was signing when he signed it. "And you own the debt," Vivian said. "I bought it," Vincent said, "some months ago, before I ever set foot in that dining room." She stopped walking, turning to face him fully, something cold moving through her chest that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. "Then that dinner wasn't business," she said slowly. "You already owned everything. You came to see what you'd be taking." "Partly," Vincent admitted, and she respected, even in that moment of building anger, that he did not lie to soften the truth. "I came to assess the man who owed me and the house he was going to lose. I did not expect to find you kneeling on the floor cleaning up glass while your family watched and said nothing." "So what am I to you?" Vivian asked, her voice tighter than she intended. "Something else you're assessing? Collateral you hadn't accounted for?" Vincent was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something lower, more deliberate. "You are the only unaccounted variable in that entire house," he said. "I have spent 3 weeks trying to decide what to do about that, and I have not yet reached a conclusion I trust." The honesty of it disarmed her more than any declaration could have, and she found herself studying his face for the calculation she expected to find there, and finding, instead, something that looked almost like uncertainty, an expression she suspected very few people in his life had ever been permitted to witness. That is when she made the mistake of looking up, and finding him already looking down at her with an intensity that made the busy street around them fall away entirely. "I should go," she said, though she did not move. "You should," Vincent agreed, and neither of them moved for a long moment more, until the sound of a passing trolley broke whatever spell had settled over the space between them, and Vivian stepped back first, putting the necessary distance between them, before either of them did something the street could witness. The debt came due on a night Vivian had not been warned about, and she learned of it only because she woke to raised voices echoing up through the mansion's halls, her uncle's pleading, her aunt's shrill fury, and beneath both of them, Vincent's voice, calm and immovable as stone. She came down the staircase in her dressing gown to find the study door open, her uncle slumped in a chair looking a decade older than he had at dinner 3 weeks before, her aunt standing rigid with her arms crossed, and Vincent seated across the desk with a folder of papers laid out before him like a verdict already rendered. "The property transfers to me by the end of the month," Vincent was saying. "You will have 30 days to arrange alternate accommodations. I am not an unreasonable man, Mr. Ashford, but I am not a patient one either, and you have tested both qualities considerably longer than I intended to allow." "You can't simply take our home," Priscilla said, her voice cracking with an emotion Vivian had never once heard from her in 7 years, something that sounded, astonishingly, like fear. "I'm not taking anything," Vincent said. "Your husband gave it to me, quite willingly, in exchange for capital he then failed to repay. I am only collecting what was already mine by contract." It was in that moment, standing in the doorway unnoticed, that Vivian understood the full shape of what was happening, and something in her, some quiet, long-buried strength she had never been permitted to use in that house, rose up sharp and sudden. "Wait," she said, stepping into the room, and every head turned toward her at once. "There has to be another arrangement. My uncle is a fool, but the staff who work here, the people who depend on this household for wages, they have nothing to do with his failures. Surely there's a version of this where the debt is collected without destroying every life attached to this house." Vincent regarded her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that looked almost like respect. "And what would you propose, Miss Ashford?" "A managed transition," Vivian said, her bookkeeper's mind already working through the numbers before her nerve could fail her. "Staff retained through the transfer, severance paid from the estate's remaining liquid assets rather than left to nothing. My aunt and uncle relocated to something smaller, but not destitute. You get your property, you get your debt satisfied, and you don't leave a trail of ruined lives behind you that someone, eventually, decides to investigate." Priscilla stared at her niece as though seeing her for the first time in 7 years, and perhaps, in some sense, she was. Vincent's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but something close enough to unsettle the entire room. "You negotiate well for a woman your aunt described as having the personality of wet paper," he said. "My aunt has been wrong about a great many things," Vivian said, and did not look away. "If you're enjoying this one, drop a comment telling me what you think happens next, because the story isn't finished yet." The negotiation, once Vivian had forced her way into it, took the better part of 2 hours, and by the end of it, Vincent had agreed to terms that surprised even Reginald, who had expected ruin and received, instead, a diminished but survivable future. Priscilla said nothing throughout the entire exchange, though Vivian caught her watching, more than once, with an expression that was not quite gratitude, but was, for the first time, something other than contempt. When the meeting finally concluded, and Reginald and Priscilla retreated upstairs to absorb what had just happened to their lives, Vincent remained in the study, and Vivian remained with him, neither of them quite ready to end whatever had just passed between them in front of witnesses. "You didn't have to fight for them," Vincent said, "after everything they've put you through." "I wasn't fighting for them," Vivian said. "I was fighting for the people who had no say in any of this. My aunt and uncle can fend for themselves. The housekeeper who's worked here 20 years cannot simply start over with nothing." Vincent studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression had shifted permanently, some final wall come down that Vivian sensed he did not allow to come down easily or often. "I have spent my entire life around people who fight only for themselves," he said. "I did not expect to find someone in that dining room who would spend her only leverage on strangers." "Is that a problem?" Vivian asked. "No," Vincent said. "It's the opposite of a problem." He crossed the room toward her slowly, and this time neither of them pulled away when the distance between them closed, and when his hand came up to rest against the side of her face, careful, deliberate, the same stillness in his touch that she had noticed in him from the very first night, she did not step back. "You should know what you're choosing," he said quietly. "If this continues, my world does not let go of people easily, and it does not stay quiet for long." "I've already seen what your world looks like," Vivian said. "I chose to stay in the car that first night instead of running. I think we're well past the point where you need to warn me." Something in his expression broke open at that, some final piece of restraint giving way. And when he kissed her, it was not the careful, testing kiss of a man uncertain of his welcome. It was absolute, the way everything about him was absolute. And Vivian understood, standing in the study of a house that no longer belonged to her aunt, that whatever came next, whatever danger followed a man like Vincent Marchetti through every door he walked through, she had already made her choice long before this moment arrived to confirm it. The rival family that had sent men into that alley 3 weeks earlier did not simply disappear once Vincent finalized his claim on the Ashford property. And within days, word reached him that his interest in a woman with no connections and no protection had become known in circles that specialized in exploiting exactly that kind of vulnerability. A man named Salvatore Greco, head of a family that had spent 2 years losing ground to Vincent's territory, decided that the fastest way to wound a man who could not otherwise be wounded was to threaten the one thing he had shown, for the first time in years, that he valued. Vivian learned of the threat not from Vincent, who would have preferred to shield her from it entirely, but from a hurried, low-voiced conversation she overheard between 2 of his men outside the townhouse where she had begun spending most of her evenings, ostensibly to help him understand the finer details of legitimate business fronts he was building to launder the family's growing fortune, though both of them understood by now that the accounting work had long since become secondary to simply being near each other. "They know about her," one of the men said. "Greco's been asking questions. Where she works, what time she leaves." Vivian did not wait to hear the rest. She walked into the room where Vincent stood at the window, the same posture she recognized now, tension coiled and ready beneath careful stillness, and said, "You weren't going to tell me." "I was handling it," Vincent said. "By keeping me in the dark," Vivian said. "That isn't handling it. That's deciding for me what I'm allowed to know about my own danger." He turned from the window, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something close to helplessness pass across his face, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough. "If something happened to you," he said, "because of what you are to me, I don't know what I would do with that. I have buried people I loved because of this life. I will not bury you too." "Then let me help you make sure that doesn't happen," Vivian said. "I'm not going to sit in a townhouse waiting to be protected while you go do something reckless on my behalf. I know the accounts, Vincent. I know where Greco's operation is vulnerable because I've been reading the ledgers you gave me for weeks. Let me use what I know." He studied her for a long moment, weighing, she suspected, every instinct that told him to keep her far from this world against the plain evidence in front of him that she was already in it, had been in it since the night she walked into that alley, and would not be talked out of it now. "Show me," he said finally. What Vivian had found in the ledgers, in the quiet hours she had spent cross-referencing shipping manifests and shell company filings out of nothing more than habit and boredom, was a pattern of financial exposure in Greco's operation that Vincent's own accountants had missed entirely. A series of transactions routed through a legitimate import business that, if exposed to the right federal auditor at the right moment, would collapse the financial foundation Greco's family had spent a decade building. It was not violence. It was worse, in its way, more permanent. And Vivian laid it out across the desk with the same steady precision she used for every ledger she had ever balanced. "You could destroy him without firing a single shot," she said. Vincent looked at the papers, then at her, something like awe moving briefly across his controlled features before he mastered it back into stillness. "Remind me never to make an enemy of you," he said. "You already have," Vivian said. "Everyone in this city knows what I am to you now." The plan required patience and precision, and a series of carefully timed disclosures that Vincent's people executed over the following 2 weeks, funneling information to a federal auditor already circling organized crime finances in the city, structured in a way that would never trace back to Vincent's family at all. Greco's operation began to collapse from the inside, slowly and then all at once. And by the time he understood what had happened to him, the damage was already irreversible, his soldiers scattering, his territory left undefended and ripe for absorption. But Greco, in the final days before his collapse, made one last desperate move, cornering Vivian outside the textile office where she still worked 3 days a week, grabbing her arm hard enough to bruise and hissing that she would regret involving herself in business that did not belong to her. She did not scream. She did not freeze. She drove the heel of her shoe hard into his instep, twisted free of his grip, and ran directly into the path of Vincent's driver, who had been shadowing her at a discreet distance for exactly this possibility. And by the time Vincent himself arrived on the scene, Greco was already being restrained by two of Vincent's men, his last play exhausted, his last threat rendered meaningless. "You said you'd handle it," Vivian said, breathless, adrenaline still coursing through her as Vincent crossed the distance between them and gripped her by both shoulders, checking her over with an intensity that made clear how close he had come to genuine panic. "I did handle it," Vincent said. "You handled the part that mattered most, apparently, before I even arrived." She laughed, a short, startled sound, more relief than humor, and Vincent pulled her against him without another word, holding her there on the street in front of his men and Greco's ruined operation, and the entire city that had watched this war play out from a careful distance. And for the first time since she had known him, she felt him exhale, fully, as though some permanent tension in him had finally been allowed to release. The threat did not vanish entirely, not in a world like Vincent's where old grudges rarely stayed buried, but Greco's family lost enough ground in the following weeks that the immediate danger passed, and life, or whatever passed for ordinary life in Vincent Marchetti's world, began to settle into something that resembled a future. Priscilla, in the aftermath of losing the mansion, relocated with Reginald to a considerably smaller house on the edge of the city, and though her pride never fully recovered from the reversal of fortune, something in her had genuinely shifted since the night Vivian negotiated terms on behalf of strangers. She sent, some months later, a short letter to Vivian, stiff and formal in the way all of Priscilla's communications had always been, but containing, buried in the careful phrasing, something that might have been an apology if read generously enough. Vivian read it twice, folded it away, and did not respond, because some wounds did not require closure to stop bleeding, only distance, and distance she finally had. Vincent gave her the deed to a small property near the harbor some months later. Not the mansion, not anything that carried the weight of what had been lost or taken, but something entirely new, entirely hers. A modest house with good light and a view of the water. And when she asked him why, he told her simply that everyone deserved a place that belonged to them and no one else. A place no one could threaten to take away. "Is this you asking me to stay?" Vivian said, standing in the empty rooms of the house that still smelled of fresh paint. "I'm not asking anything," Vincent said. "I'm making certain that whatever you choose it because you want it, not because you have nowhere else to go." "And if what I want is you," Vivian said, "does that come with the house or separately?" Something in his face finally broke fully open, the last careful wall gone. And when he answered her, it was not with words at all, but with the kind of certainty that needed none. She stayed, not because the mansion was gone, not because her aunt's cruelty had left her with nowhere else, but because somewhere between a shattered wineglass and a ledger full of another man's ruin, she had found in Vincent Marchetti something she had spent her whole life being told she would never deserve. And she had chosen, with open eyes and full knowledge of every danger his world carried, to keep it. If this story kept you hooked until the very end, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more, because there are plenty more dangerous men and the women who refuse to run from them still waiting to be told.